New Year.
Yeah, Oliver. Excellent. Well, thank you guys so much for having us out here today. Unfortunately, as she mentioned earlier, Miss Hitomi, our outreach coordinator, was pulled away for a separate event. And a couple of quick boilerplate statements. First of all, thank you guys for having us out here, for inviting us to do this talk. This is the kind of thing that our museum is supposed to do. Come out and interact with the community, basically in any setting, to talk about Asian cultures, history, and information of any kind, be it natural history, natural science, the culture, ancient or modern, the arts, any of it, and give people a chance to interact with it and understand it better. Um, the other thing I would like to mention is a compliment to you guys. This is probably the only Lunar New Year talk I've done that was actually on the Lunar New Year. Um, yeah, it usually never happens that way. And Lunar New Year is in, let me check my clock here, probably about 2 hours at this point. Depending on where you go and whose definition you use, the Lunar New Year is either at the start of the full moon, so that whatever point in the day, it's about 1:30 today, that the moon will be highest, or, and you're at the next lunar cycle, or it is at sundown on the day of the end of the lunar cycle. So depending on where you're from, it's either going to be 1:30 or it's going to be about 5:30 when the sun goes down. By the way, you guys are the closest to exact on the time I've ever had a talk, so this is great. Um, it just kind of happened that way. The Lunar New Year, kind of a brief introduction to it. It's also called Chinese New Year. That is a colloquialism, but an accurate one to a great extent, because most of the stories and origins and originations of the tales, of the folk tales, come from China. The thing that Hannah was talking about earlier with neon is a Chinese story. It comes from somewhere in rural China about 2,000 years ago. The original stories vary. They always look something a little like that. The version I like to give when we're doing a talk at the museum involves a older villager from a neighboring village who dealt with a similar dragon coming over and telling May what to do, having used the scientific method to figure out the last dragon. That just happens to be my favorite version. But they're all a little different. A couple thousand years of reiteration. They change, just as all of these speeches do, including mine. And the other thing that happens is that it is spread out over dozens of different cultures and dozens of different nations. Not only is China fairly diverse in its original ethnic origins, and is even today, but it is spread out. Lunar New Year is all throughout East Asia, including Japan, that does not do Lunar New Year on the lunar date and does all of the traditions on January 1st of the Gregorian calendar, just does it all with regular Gregorian New Year, does many of the same traditions and does them somewhat differently. That is the basic introduction to the history of it. The cultural aspect, as I've just alluded to, changes a lot depending on where you're from. All of East Asia does it. Our museum does have to make that distinction when we're talking, because the lady who started our museum explicitly used the old Greek definition of Asia. So all the way from the Bosphorus Straits to Hawaii gets to be part of our mission, depending on what we're doing, which is a very lovely problem to have, but does mean we have to denote. China, Nepal, Tibet, parts of Mongolia, Taiwan, Hong Kong, the Philippines, Korea, north and south, and then most of Southeast Asia, Laos, Singapore, Vietnam, and various functions do the Lunar New Year. And the main thrust is what you saw with May and Neon. It is an attempt to celebrate one's wealth, have a large party, and flush away ill omens and ill spirits from the previous year. Generally, especially in the Chinese version, it is also about giving away wealth and good fortune to other people. It is about being able to provide for others. Your loved ones, perhaps you're a feudal lord and these are those in your care, your family, you're going to have extra wealth. And the red envelopes that you'll see being given away at the museum and several other places this week are the little red envelopes have a couple of coins in them. In many cases, it is simply symbolic. A lot of them are going to have plastic coins, some are going to have candy. It's not even about giving away the wealth itself. It's about the symbolic act of being able to give away. The other thing is that it is a harvest festival. Much as you saw the story in Yan, it is a chance to have the festival, party very hard, very loud, depending on where you're from, and celebrate the year in the past as you go into the spring and the eventual spring harvest. Foods that would be used for that, again, vary depending on location. It's almost always some variation on dumplings, though. Dumplings travel real well, especially before you have refrigeration. So they were always very popular in the traditional and historic versions of the parties and celebrations. It's still done even now that way. A lot of noodles, a lot of rice, a lot of fish is used. Fish is very fatty, very nutritious, very healthy fats. So anywhere that has fish readily available, fish becomes part of the feast. That's true of most feast stories, but especially Lunar New Year. And it is the number one holiday in most of East Asia. Everything east of India, it is either the number one or number two holiday. Some of them have a specific one that's bigger. Some of them will have religious holidays that are bigger. In Japan's case, the New Year on January 1st is the biggest holiday, but it is still the biggest thing. The other element you will also see with these parties is that they are about 2 weeks long. That is in part because they are such a large festival, but was also an excuse for people historically to travel to see their loved ones, their hometowns, perhaps to leave your hometown to find loved ones who had left. Grandparents travel to see the grandkids, or vice versa. This was an excuse for the administrative states, historically, pre-modern times, to be able to shut down for a week or two so that people could travel and so that their own nobility and important personnel could travel. The Chinese zodiac is the version that most of these places are going to use, although there are some variations. Today is the year of the rabbit here in, let me check my clock again so I can say it with accuracy. Pretty soon, about another hour and a half, 2 hours, it'll be the year of the rabbit. It is a 12-year cycle, and on the end of the last of the 12 years, start of the 13th year, it cycles up again. And when it is your year, the year you were born in, it is supposed to be a particularly lucky year for you. That may not have worked out for folks that were year of the rat. That was 2020. Yeah, that didn't work out. That's been my joke for a little while now, because it's about as light as you can make that. But your year again, auspicious year, particularly good year. And the zodiac is not based, well, raise your hands if you understand the Western zodiac, the old Greek one that people will use, on Tinder or in a bar trying to, what's your sign? Okay. Yeah, that one's been going on longer than I've been alive. The Greek zodiac is based on what the sun was going to rise in, what constellation, when you were born, what time of year. And it has to do with the 12 or so, there's some variation to that, different zodiac signs and different constellations that the Greeks had used for mapping out time of year, in large part. Well, in this case, each year, on the Lunar New Year, changes to a new year, and it is based on a race that one of the first gods in early Chinese mythology, the Jade Emperor, had between 12 different animals. And in short, they were racing to have this big feast in their honor and have a new year named after them as they go. And so what would happen was he brought in 12 of the most interesting animals that you'd normally think about. The story changes depending on where you are. It'll actually be Year of the Cat in a lot of places, and Year of the Rat in Vietnam here in about an hour and a half. But it's Year of the Rabbit in China, and they were the ones who wrote it, so most people use their version. The race is ultimately won by a mouse, a rat, who figures out to ride on the back of an ox the whole way, because the ox was going to be the strongest and bravest contestant, being an ox, and decided to ride on its back, guide it and help it find where it needed to go, make sure to give it words of encouragement when it reached a large scary bridge, when it reached a large river that it had to ford and wade across, give it words of encouragement and help it along, and in exchange for riding on its back. And right when it got to the finish line, the rat hopped off and took off across the finish line, about this much ahead of the ox. So the cycle always starts with the rat and then the ox, almost everywhere that does it. Then is the year we just left, which is the year of the tiger. The tiger hesitated a little bit too much when it got to the river. Being a kitty cat, didn't want to cross the water. And that's why the ox was able to pull ahead. And then in the original story, it is tiger, rabbit, jumped across, snake and then dragon, or dragon and then snake, depending on where you were. And the pig always came in last because it got distracted going to find food. And so the pig is always last before it's the year of the rat again. And that is the story of the Chinese zodiac. We do these kinds of talks all the time. This one was probably, as you're noticing, a little bit more vague because I was mentioning all the different cultural aspects to it. Vietnam does it somewhat completely different, even though it does all the same foods. It does the zodiac completely different. Nepal does all the same traditions, as does some of the highlands in Tibet, as opposed to the lowlands in central China. They do all the same traditions, but the story of Neon is completely different. The story Hannah did. Again, Japan does almost all the rest of the traditions, but does it on January 1st and just attaches it to the Gregorian calendar. So these are all a little bit different. And as you encounter people who've either traveled to different Asian places or are of different Asian backgrounds, I encourage you to ask them what their traditions were, either due to geographical differences, cultural differences, religious differences, or simply family and logistical differences, much as people often cook a turkey or grill a brisket here for Christmas rather than do a ham as is done in parts up north. Ask them what their differences were and how they did it. It's a very easy conversation starter, and it's something that most folks of Asian descent would be very happy to share because Lunar New Year is so well known. So with that, I think I'll step out of the way. Is there anything I should add? Is there any questions?
I think the story of the Asian Museum here, who was from here,
Yes.
is a very, very compelling story.
She is an interesting story all by herself, and we are actually working with A&M Corpus Christi, the Island University, to scan up a lot of her documents, photos, and files. I'm so excited about Lunar New Year, I forgot about Miss Chandler just a little bit. Her name was Billy Trimble Chandler. She went over and spent, call it about 25 years on and off in Japan primarily. She traveled to the Philippines. She was in Korea and Taiwan at various points. But Japan was her favorite throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s, traveling on the American bases there, really during occupied Japan. But even after, with the large American military presence post-World War II, teaching the children that were on the American military bases. It was very much a homeroom setup. This was very much an informal setup, very much a homeroom, mixed ages and grades, much as the setup is here. And she was teaching them primarily using these clay dolls and these big oil paintings, about the size of the windows over there, as props that she would have commissioned to show off in her classroom. And that was ultimately how Miss Chandler started our museum, and the place that I work now, is she used the props to eventually set up an entire museum. Basically 90% of it when she opened it was the clay dolls, the Hakata dolls, that you'll see we actually have the largest collection of in the world in our displays, and the various oil paintings. They were visual aids to show off in classroom settings. And as soon as she realized she was retiring and coming back to the US to do it, she literally went through, found a few more items, requested some ivory donations, because even by 1973, when she's traveling back, donations were the only good way to get ivory for a museum. The bans were already starting to take effect on the ivory trade, thank goodness. And she gathered up that plus a little more and set up a museum down off of hills. The expansion has been to cover all of Asia properly, really Japan at a few items elsewhere and a few classes about elsewhere. And it traveled different sites and has now been moved since about 1996, has been moved to the site on Chaparral in the Sea Arts District where you currently find us. We have a number of different displays and a number of different programs going on. We will be very, very busy this summer. Weekly programs almost every week. We'll be doing something, usually 2-3 times a week, everywhere from mochi making classes to simple historical and cultural talks like this. We have a couple classroom setups just a little smaller in this room that we'll be using for that kind of thing. So, yeah. And the reason she ended up back here in Corpus Christi when she started the museum was because she had family here. She had originally thought about coming back to a larger city, but a couple of her children and her grandchildren had since settled here, and she decided she would rather do it with their help, as she was getting a little older by then and was retiring, and she wanted the extra manpower to help unpack and plan things. So that was why Corpus Christi now has one of only 6 Asian cultures museums in the U.S. Kind of fortuitous. Yeah, only 6, and the only one in the South. The Washington, D.C., Chicago, New York, Seattle, and San Francisco. And we have the other. So, yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
I missed a lot of your programming, and I was wondering if you were going to redo the tea ceremony or the motion making class.
Yes. So what Miss Hitomi is doing is she is actually here for 2 years on a grant program. She just got here a couple months ago from Kyoto. And yeah, we were very fortunate to be part of that program. And she will be doing a wide range of Japanese cultural events. And what that will do is it will free up a little extra time for some folks. My special environmental advocate museum, we will be doing of this year, Gregorian year, and she'll be doing the rest of the schedule based in part on what's been popular, and our tea ceremony was huge. We had probably more people than we'd seen in months for that event. Our mochi making classes have been huge. Our sushi making class we haven't done yet, but the pre-registration filled up. And we'll be talking with the Vietnamese Student Association and this one Vietnamese theater group to get them out more, because they've also been very successful with us. So, yeah. So, any other questions? Because I probably forgot something. I always do. Yeah.
You want to tell us a little about yesterday? Fashion?
Yes. So, as you saw yesterday, we had our big Lunar New Year party. Most facilities and groups that do a Lunar New Year party do it the day before the Lunar New Year. That is or the weekend before. It's easiest before families start traveling. Much like a corporate Christmas party is done earlier, mid-December, rather than, the 23rd. And what we did was we had our education department do our lion dance. The A&M team that usually comes with us hadn't had a chance to practice and get scheduled, so we'll have them come out later in the year, perhaps for Art Walk. And we had our education department do that. Miss Hitomi was actually using a drum set that was on loan from a facility in San Antonio. That's what she's doing today, is bringing it back up to them to help them with a separate program. And we also had a couple of martial arts demonstrations from one of the local downtown martial arts groups. They did both karate and iaido, which is the more modern style of katana style sword play, similar to Bushido, but the more modernized dueling style. And they did a couple different demonstrations, all with safety gear and dulled blades. Nobody was injured. But they did that, and we also did a big karaoke party. Karaoke is the big difference in Japan and a little bit Korea. Karaoke is huge in those two places. And that is a big one that's used not only just for the average party or the average Super Bowl party or just going out on a Saturday night, but is a huge part of the Japanese New Year. And we actually, one of our media people was Gabby, the one in the purple shirt. She actually did that as a pilot program to see how that would work for doing a bigger karaoke party and karaoke themed event later in the year. We'll probably do one around spring break.